Hi, Grandma here, and I'm reading from The Hiding Place, and today we're going to start with The Secret Room. The previous chapter took place in the early 1940s and talked about the invasion in Germany and some of the changes that have happened in the Netherlands since they have surrendered to the German army. And I think this chapter we're going to find out even more. The Secret Room. It was Sunday, May 10th, 1942, exactly 2 years after the fall of Holland. The sunny spring skies, the flowers in the lamppost boxes did not at all reflect the city's mood. German soldiers wandered aimlessly through the streets, some looking as if they had not recovered from a hard Saturday night, some already on the lookout for girls, and a few hunting for a place for worship. Each month, the occupation seemed to grow harsher, restrictions more numerous. The latest heartache for Dutchmen was an edict making it a crime to sing the Wilhelmus, our national anthem. Father, Betsy, and I were on our way to the Dutch Reformed Church in Wilson, a small town not far from Haarlem, where Peter had won the post of organist in competition against 40 older and more experienced musicians. The organ at Velsen was one of the finest in the country, though the train seemed slower each time we went frequently. Peter was already playing, invisible in the tall organ loft, when we squeezed into the crowded pew. That was the one thing the occupation had done for Holland. Churches were packed. Now remember, Peter is Corrie's nephew, Nolly's son. After hymns and prayers came the sermon. A good one today, I thought. I wish Peter would pay closer attention. He regarded sermons as interesting only to venerable relics like his mother and me. I had reached 50 that spring. To Peter, the age at which life had definitely passed by. I would beg him to remember that death and ultimate issues would come for any of us at any age, especially these days, but he would reply charmingly that he was too fine a musician to die young. The closing prayers were said, and then, electrically, the whole church sat at attention. Without preamble, every stop pulled out to full volume. Peter was playing the Wilhelmus, the national anthem. Father at 82 was the first one on his feet. Now everyone was standing. From somewhere in back of us, a voice sang out the words. Another joined in, and another. Then we were all singing together, the full voice of Holland singing her forbidden anthem. We sang at the top of our lungs, sang our oneness, our hope, our love for Queen and country. On this anniversary of defeat, it seemed almost for a moment that we were the victors. Afterward, we waited for Peter at the small side door of the church. It was a long time before he was free to come away with us. So many people wanted to embrace him, to shake his hand, thump his back. Clearly, he was enormously pleased with himself. But now that the moment has passed, I was, as usual, angry with him. The Gestapo was certain to hear about it, perhaps already had. Their eyes and ears were everywhere. I thought of Nolly home fixing Sunday dinner for us all. I thought of Peter's brothers and sisters. And Flip, what if he lost the principalship of the school for this? And for what had Peter risked so much? Not for people's lives, but for a gesture. For a moment's meaningless defiance. At Bos on Hoevenstraat, however, Peter was a hero, as one by one his family made us describe again what had happened. The only members of the household who felt as I did were the two Jewish women standing at Nolly's. One of them was an elderly Austrian woman whom Wilhelm had sent into hiding here. Katrine, as the family had rechristened her, was posing as the von Verden's housemaid, although Nolly confided to me that she had yet so much as to make her own bed. Probably she did not know how, as she came from a wealthy and aristocratic family. The other woman was a young blonde, blue-eyed Dutch Jew with flawless false identity papers supplied by the Dutch National Underground itself. The papers were so good, and Annelies looked so unlike the Nazi stereotype of a Jew, that she went freely in and out of the house, shopping, helping out at the school, giving herself out to be a friend of the family whose husband had died in the bombing at Rotterdam. Katrine and Annelies could not understand any more than I could Peter's deliberately doing something that would attract the attention of the authorities. I spent an anxious afternoon, tensing at the sound of every motor, for only the police, Germans, and NSBers had automobiles nowadays. But the time came to go home to the Bay, and still nothing had happened. I worried 2 more days, then decided either Peter had not been reported or that the Gestapo had more important things to occupy them. It was Wednesday morning, just as Father and I were unlocking our workbenches, that Peter's little sister, Cocky, burst into the shop. "Opa, Tante Corrie, they came for Peter, they took him away." Who? Where? But she didn't know, and it was 3 days before the family learned he'd been taken to the federal prison in Amsterdam. It was 7:55 in the evening, just a few minutes before the new curfew hour of 8 o'clock. Peter had been in prison for 2 weeks. Father and Betsy and I were seated around the dining room table, Father replacing watches in their pockets, and Betsy doing needlework. Our big black, slightly Persian cat curled contentedly in her lap. A knock on the alley door made me glance in the window mirror. Then in the bright spring twilight stood a woman. She carried a small suitcase and, odd for the time of year, wore a fur coat, gloves, and a heavy veil. I ran down and opened the door. "Can I come in?" she asked. The voice was high, pitched in fear. "Of course." I stepped back. The woman looked over her shoulder before moving into the hallway. "My name is Kleermacher. I'm a Jew." "How do you do?" I reached out to take her bag, but she held on to it. "Won't you come upstairs?" Father and Betsy stood as we entered the dining room. "Mrs. Kleermacher, my father, and my sister." "Oh, I was about to make some tea," cried Betsy. "You're just in time to join us." Father drew out a chair from the table, and Mrs. Kleermacher sat down, still gripping the suitcase. The tea consisted of old leaves, which had been crushed and reused so often they did little more than color the water. But Mrs. Kleermacher accepted it gratefully, plunging into the story of how her husband had been arrested some months before, her son gone into hiding. Yesterday, the SD, the political police who worked under the Gestapo, had ordered her to close the family clothing store. She was afraid now to go back to the apartment above it. She had heard that we had befriended a man on this street. "In this household," Father said, "God's people are always welcome." "We have 4 empty beds upstairs," said Betsy. "Your problem will be choosing which one to sleep in." Then, to my astonishment, she added, "First, though, give me a hand with these tea things." I could hardly believe my ears. Betsy never let anyone help her in the kitchen. "I'm just a fussy old maid," she'd say. But Mrs. Kleermacher had jumped to her feet with pathetic eagerness and was already stacking plates and cups. Just 2 nights later, the same scene was repeated. The time was again just before 8 o'clock on another bright May evening. Again, there was a furtive knock at the side door. This time, an elderly couple was standing outside. "Come in." It was the same story, the same tight-clutched possessions, the same fearful glance and tentative tread, the story of neighbors arrested, the fear that tomorrow their turn would come. That night, after prayer time, the 6 of us faced our dilemma. "The location is too dangerous," I told our 3 guests. "We're half a block away from the police headquarters, and yet I don't know where else to suggest." Clearly, it was time to visit Willem again. So the next day, I repeated the difficult trip to Hilversum. Willem, I said, we have 3 Jews staying right at the Bay. Can you get places for them in the country? Willem pressed his fingers to his eyes, and I noticed suddenly how much white was in his beard. It's getting harder, he said, harder every month. They're feeling the food shortage now, even on the farms. I still have addresses, yes, a few, but they won't take anyone without a ration card. Without a ration card? But Jews aren't issued ration cards. I know. Willem turned to stare out the window. For the first time, I wondered how he and Tina were feeding the elderly men and women in their care. I know, he repeated, and ration cards can't be counterfeited. They're changed too often and they're too easy to spot. Identity cards are different. I know several printers who do them. Of course, you need a photographer. A photographer? Printers? What was Willem talking about? Willem, if people need ration cards and there aren't any counterfeit ones, what do they do? Willem turned slowly from the window. He seemed to have forgotten me and my particular problem. Ration cards? He gestured vaguely. Well, you steal them. I stared at this Dutch Reformed clergyman. Then, Willem, could you get 3 stolen cards? No, Corrie, I'm watched. Don't you understand that? Every move I make is watched. He put an arm around my shoulder and went on more kindly. Even if I can continue working for a while, it'll be far better for you to develop your own sources. The less connection with me, the less connection with anyone else, the better. Joggling home on the crowded train, I turned Willem's words over and over in my mind. Your own sources. That sounded so professional. How was I going to find a source of stolen ration cards? Who in the world did I know? And at that moment, a name appeared in my mind. Fred Kornstra. Fred was the man who used to read the electric meter at the Bay. The Kornstras had a retarded daughter, now a grown woman, who attended the church I had been conducting for the feeble-minded for some 20 years. And now Fred had a new job working for the food office. Wasn't it in the department where ration books were issued? That evening, after supper, I bumped over the brick streets to the Kunstra house. The tires on my faithful old bicycle had finally given out, and I had joined the hundreds clattering about town on metal wheel rims. Each bump reminded me jarringly of my 50 years. Now, you might wonder why a 50-year-old woman has to use a bicycle to get around town. Well, even today in the Netherlands, people use bicycles all the time. They have cars, but back in the 1940s, in a town like this, there would not have been very many cars. It's a very flat country, and so it's very easy to bicycle. But it's not so easy when you don't have tires on your bicycle and you are just riding it on the rims. So, to continue. Fred, a bald man with a military bearing, came to the door and stared at me blankly when I said I wanted to talk to him about the Sunday service. He invited me in, closed the door, and said, "Now, Corrie, what is it really you want to see me about?" Lord, I prayed skillfully. If it is not safe to confide in Fred, stop this conversation before it's too late. I must tell you that we've had some unexpected company at the Bay. First, it was a woman, then a couple. When I got back this afternoon, another couple. I paused for just an instant. They are Jews. Fred's expression did not change. We can provide safe places for these people, but they must provide something too. Ration cards. Fred's eyes smiled. So now I know why you came here. Fred, is there any way you can give out extra cards more than you report? None at all, Corrie. These cards have to be accounted for a dozen ways. They're checked and double-checked. The hope that had begun to mount in me tumbled, but Fred was frowning. Unless, he began. Unless there should be a holdup. The food office in Utrecht was robbed last month, but the men were caught. He was silent a moment. If it happened at noon, he said slowly, when just the record clerk and I are there, and if they found us tied and gagged, he snapped his fingers, and I know just the man who might do it. Do you remember Don't, I said, remembering Willem's warning. Don't tell me who, and don't tell me how. Just get the cards if you possibly can. Fred stared at me a moment. How many do you need? I opened my mouth to say 5, but the number that unexpectedly and astonishingly came out instead was 100. When Fred opened the door to me just a week later, I gasped at the sight of him. Both eyes were greenish purple, his lower lip cut and swollen. My friend took very naturally to the part, as all he would say. So, how did he get injured so badly? Well, his friend wanted to make it look like they had been robbed and roughed up, and his friend had beaten him up a little too well. But he had the cards. On the table in a brown manila envelope were 100 passports to safety. Fred had already torn the continuing coupon from each one. The final coupon was presented at the food office the last day of each month in exchange for the next month's card. With these coupons, Fred could legally continue to issue us 100 cards. We agreed that it would be risky for me to keep coming to his house each month. What if he came to the Bayet instead, dressed in his old meterman uniform? The meter in the Bayet was in the back hall at the foot of the stairs. When I got home that afternoon, I pried up the tread at the bottom step as Peter had done higher to hide the radio, and found a hollow space inside. Peter would be proud of me, I thought as I worked, and was flooded by a wave of lonesomeness for the brave and cocksure boy. But even he would have to admit, I concluded as I stepped back at last to admire the complete hideaway, that a watchmaker's hand and eye were worth something. The hinge was hidden deep in the wood. The ancient riser was undisturbed. I was ridiculously pleased with myself. We had our first test of the system on July 1st. Fred was to come in through the shop as he always had, carrying the cards beneath his shirt. He would come at 5:30, when Betsy would have the back hall free of callers. To my horror, at 5:25, the shop door opened and in stepped a policeman. He was a tall man with close-cropped orange-red hair whom I knew by name, Rolf Van Vliet, but little else. He'd come to the 100th birthday party, but so had half the force. Certainly he was not one of Betsy's regulars for winter morning coffee. Rolf had brought in a watch that needed cleaning, and he seemed in a mood to talk. My throat had gone dry, but Father chatted cheerfully as he took off the back of Rolf's watch and examined it. What were we going to do? There was no way to warn Fred Koonstra. Promptly at 5:30, the door of the shop opened, and in he walked, dressed in his blue work clothes. It seemed to me that his chest was too thick by at least a foot. With magnificent aplomb, Fred nodded to Father, the policeman, me. Good evening, courteous but a little bored. He strode through the door at the rear of the shop, shut it behind him. My ears strained to hear him lift the secret lid. There. Surely Rolf must have heard that too. The door behind us opened again. So great was Fred's control that he had not ducked out the alleyway exit, but came strolling back through the shop. "Good evening," he said. "A good evening." He reached the street door and was gone. We had got away with it this time, but somehow, some way, we were going to have to work out a warning system. For meanwhile in the weeks since Mrs. Clearmaker's unexpected visit, a great deal had happened at the Bayet. Supplied with ration cards, Mrs. Claymaker and the elderly couple and the new arrivals and the next had homes in safer locations. But still the hunted people kept coming, and the needs were often more complicated than ration cards and addresses. If a Jewish woman became pregnant, where could she go to have a baby? If a Jew in hiding died, how could they be buried? "Develop your own sources," Willem had said, and from the moment Fred Kunstra's name had popped into my head, an uncanny realization had been growing in me. We were friends with half of Harlem. We knew nurses in the maternity hospital. We knew clerks in the records office. We knew someone in every business and every service in the city. We didn't know, of course, the political views of all these people, but, and here I felt a strange leaping in my heart, God did. My job was simply to follow his leading, one step at a time, holding every decision up to him in prayer. I knew I was not clever or subtle or sophisticated. If the Bayet was becoming a meeting place for need and supply, it was through some strategy far higher than mine. A few nights after Fred's first Meterman visit, the alley bell rang long after curfew. I sped downstairs expecting another sad and stammering refugee. Betsy and I had already made up beds for 4 new overnight guests that evening, a Jewish woman and her 3 small children. But to my surprise, close against the wall of the dark alley stood Keek. "Get your bicycle," he ordered with his usual young abruptness, "and put on a sweater. I have some people I want you to meet." Now, Keek is Corrie's nephew. Now, after curfew? But I knew it was useless to ask questions. Keek's bicycle was tireless too, the wheel rims swathed in cloth. He wrapped mine also to keep down the clatter, and soon we were pedaling through the blackened out streets of Harlem at a speed that would have scared me even in the daylight. "Put a hand on my shoulder," Keek whispered. "I know the way." We crossed dark side streets, crested bridges, wheeled around invisible corners. At last we crossed a broad canal, and I knew we had reached the fashionable suburb of Erdenhout. We turned into a driveway beneath shadowy trees. To my astonishment, Keek picked up my bicycle and carried both his and mine up the front steps. A serving girl with starched white apron and ruffled cap opened the door. The entrance was jammed with bicycles. Then I saw him, one eye smiling at me, the other at the door, his vast stomach hastening ahead of him. Pickwick. He led Keek and me into the drawing room where, sipping coffee and chatting in small groups, was the most distinguished-looking group of men and women I had ever seen. But all my attention, that first moment, was the inexpressibly fragrant aroma in that room. Surely, was it possible they were drinking real coffee? Pickwick drew me a cup from the silver urn on the sideboard. It was coffee. After 2 years, rich, black, pungent Dutch coffee. He poured himself a cup too, dropping in his usual 5 lumps of sugar as though rationing had never been invented. Another starched and ruffled maid was passing a tray heaped high with cakes. Gobbling and gulping, I trailed around the room after Pickwick, shaking the hands of the people he singled out. They were strange introductions, for no names were mentioned, only occasionally an address and "Ask for Mrs. Smith." When I had met my fourth Smith, Keek explained with a grin, it's the only last name in the underground. Now, Smith, S-M-I-T, is our name, Smith, S-M-I-T-H, and that is a very common name in the United States also. So it's a good name to use when you're trying to hide your real name. So this was really and truly the underground. But where were these people from? And I had never laid eyes on any of them. A second later, I realized with a shiver down my spine that I was meeting the national group. So this was really and truly the underground. But where were these people from? I had never laid eyes on any of them. Their chief work, I learned from bits of conversation, was liaison with England and the Free Dutch forces fighting elsewhere on the continent. They also maintained the underground route through which downed Allied plane crews reached the North Sea coast. But they were instantly sympathetic with my effort to help Haarlem's Jews. I blushed to the hair roots to hear Pickwick describe me as the head of the operation in this city. A hollow space under the stairs and some haphazard friendships were not an operation. The others here obviously competent, disciplined, and professional, but they greeted me with grave courtesy, murmuring what they had to offer as we shook hands. False identity papers, the use of a car with official government plates, signature forgery. In a far corner of the room, Pickwick introduced me to a frail-appearing little man with a wispy goatee. That's a beard. Our host informs me, the little man began formally, that your headquarters building lacks a secret room. This is a danger for all, those you are helping as well as yourselves, and those who work with you. With your permission, I will pay you a visit in the coming week. Years later, I learned that he was one of the most famous architects in Europe. I only knew him as Mr. Smith. Just before Keek and I started our dash back to the Bay, Pickwick slipped an arm through mine. My dear, I have good news. I understand Peter is about to be released. So he was, 3 days later, thinner, paler, and not a whit daunted by his 2 months in a concrete cell. Nolly, Tina, and Betsy used up a month's sugar ration baking cakes for his welcome home party. And one morning, soon afterward, the first customer in the shop was a small, thin-bearded man named Smith. Father took his jeweler's glass from his eye. If there was one thing he loved better than making a new acquaintance, it was discovering a link with an old one. Smith, he said eagerly, I know several Smiths in Amsterdam. Are you by any chance related to the family who... Father, I interrupted, this is the man I told you about. He's come to inspect the house. A building inspector? Then you must not be the Smith with offices on the Grote Houtstraat. I wonder that I haven't. Father, I pleaded, he's not a building inspector, and his name is not Smith. Not Smith? Together, Mr. Smith and I attempted to explain, but Father simply could not understand a person being called a name not his own. As I led Mr. Smith back into the hall, we heard him musing to himself, I once knew a Smith on Konigstraat. Mr. Smith examined and approved the hiding place for ration cards and beneath the bottom step. He also pronounced acceptable the warning system we had worked out. This was a triangular-shaped wooden sign advertising Alpina watches that I had placed in the dining room window. As long as the sign was in place, it was safe to enter. And when I showed him a cubby hole behind the corner cupboard in the dining room, he shook his head. Some ancient redesigning of the house had left a crawl space in that corner, and we'd been secreting jewelry, silver coins, and other valuables there since the start of the occupation. Not only the rabbi had brought us his library, but other Jewish families had brought their treasures to the Bayeux for safekeeping. The space was large enough that we had believed a person could crawl in there if necessary, but Mr. Smith dismissed it without a second glance. First place they'd look. Don't bother to change it, though. It's only silver. We're interested in saving people, not things. He started up the narrow corkscrew stairs, and as he mounted, so did his spirits. He paused in delight at the odd-placed landings, pounded on the crooked walls, and laughed aloud as the floor levels of the two old houses continued out of phase. Now, if you'll recall, this is what the house looks like. This is the main house, and this is the watch shop. This is the spiral staircase that goes up. This is the second house that's been attached to the first house. But if you look carefully, you'll see the floors on this house don't match the floors in this house. So as you're going up the stairs, you have to step off and go down or go up into to reach the other floor. Okay, and continuing. Where was I? What an impossibility, he said in awestruck voice. What an improbably, unbelievable, unpredictable impossibility. Miss Tinboom, if all the houses were constructed like this one, you would see before you a less worried man. At last, at the very top of the stairs, he entered my room and gave a little cry of delight. This is it, he exclaimed. You want your hiding place as high as possible. He went on eagerly. Give you the best chance to reach it while the search is going on below. He leaned out the window, craning his thin neck. The little fawn's beard pointed this way and that. But this is my bedroom. Mr. Smith paid no attention. He was already measuring. He moved the heavy, wobbly old wardrobe away from the wall with surprising ease and pulled my bed into the center of the room. This is where the false wall will go. Excitedly, he drew out a pencil and drew a line along the floor. 30 inches from the back wall, he stood up and gazed at it moodily. Okay, so let's look at this map again. And here is Corrie's room. And you'll see that here is the secret room where a false wall has been put in. But it's only 30 inches, which is maybe this big. People aren't going to be able to live in there very long. It's too small. That's as big as I dare, he said. It will take a cot mattress, though. Oh, yes, easily. I tried again to protest, but Mr. Smith had forgotten I existed. Over the next few days, he and his workmen were in and out of our house constantly. They never knocked. At each visit, each man carried in something. Tools in a folded newspaper, a few bricks in a briefcase. Wood, he exclaimed when I ventured to wonder if a wooden wall would not be easier to build. Wood sounds hollow. Hear it in a minute. No. Brick is the only thing for false walls. After the wall was up, the plasterer came, then the carpenter, finally the painter. 6 days after he had begun, Mr. Smith called Father, Betsy, and me to see. We stood in the doorway and gaped. The smell of fresh paint was everywhere, but surely nothing in this room was newly painted. All 4 walls had that streaked and grimy look that old rooms got in cold, burning Harlem. The ancient molding ran unbroken around the ceiling, chipped and peeling here and there, obviously undisturbed for 150 years. Old water stains streaked the back wall, a wall that even I, who had lived a century in this room, could scarcely believe was not the original, but set back a precious 2.5 feet from the true wall of the building. Built-in bookshelves ran along the false wall, old sagging shelves whose blistered wood bore the same water stains as the wall behind them. Down in the far left-hand corner, beneath the bottom shelf, a sliding panel 2 feet high and 2 wide opened into the secret room. So there's no door into the secret room, but it's just a panel of wood that's, 2 feet by 2 feet. Okay, and it was a sliding panel. Mr. Smith stooped and silently pulled the panel up. On hands and knees, Betsy and I crawled into the narrow room behind it. Once inside, we could stand up, or even stretch out one at a time on a single mattress. A concealed vent, cunningly let into the real wall, allowed air to enter from outside. "Keep a water jug here," said Mr. Smith, crawling in behind us. "Change the water once a week. Hardtack and vitamins, keep indefinitely." Hardtack is a type of bread that is more like a cracker. "Anytime there is anyone in the house whose presence is unofficial, all possessions except the clothes actually on his back must be stored in here." Dropping to our knees again, we crawled single file out into the bedroom. "Move back into this room," he told me. "Everything exactly as before." With his fist, he struck the wall above the bookshelves. "The Gestapo could search for a year," he said. "They'll never find this one." Well, that's good to know, isn't it? So that's the end of the secret place, the hiding place, the secret room. Our next chapter is called Eusie, E-U-S-I-E. And I always like to guess what the chapter is going to be about, and I'm going to guess that it's going to be about a person with the name of Eusie. So we'll see. Okay, bye-bye for now.